Hello and welcome. You don't need to do anything right now. Just listen, and let the day fall behind you. Tonight, we'll drift through a story from long ago, not of battles or kings, but of the quiet corners history almost forgot. And if, somewhere along the way, a part of this story speaks to you, feel free to leave a comment, or simply subscribe for more sleepy history. For now, close your eyes. Let the noise fade. And let's begin. Picture this, it's 6 a.m. on a cold London morning in 1905. While the wealthy Ashworth family sleeps soundly in their silk-lined beds, 14-year-old Mary stumbles through the darkness of the servants' quarters, her hands already cracked and bleeding from yesterday's work. She has exactly 12 minutes to light 15 fireplaces before the family wakes, or she'll face punishment that could leave her without food for days. This was the Edwardian era, a time we romanticize as elegant and refined, but the brutal reality was a world divided by invisible walls of class that determined whether you lived like royalty or died in poverty. The moment Mary strikes that first match, she sets in motion a clockwork universe of rigid hierarchy that governed every breath, every step, every glance in Edwardian Britain. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about this supposedly golden age. Because behind the glittering facade of garden parties and grand estates lay a society so ruthlessly stratified that your birth determined not just your destiny, but whether you'd even survive to see your 30th birthday. Let's step into the Ashworth mansion at precisely 7 o'clock in the morning. The house awakens not with gentle stirring, but with military precision. Upstairs, Lady Margaret Ashworth rings a small silver bell beside her bed, once for her lady's maid, twice for tea, 3 times if she requires her husband to be woken immediately. She doesn't know Mary's name, though the girl has worked in her house for 3 years. Mary is simply the scullery maid, as interchangeable as the coal that fuels the fireplaces she tends. But here's what's fascinating and terrifying about Edwardian society. Lady Ashworth herself is trapped in a prison just as confining as Mary's, only hers is gilded with silk and shame. While Mary scrubs floors until her knees bleed, Lady Ashworth cannot so much as choose what to wear without consulting the rigid social codes that govern her every appearance. She owns 12 different dresses just for receiving morning visitors, yet she has never once in her life prepared her own meal, chosen her own reading material without approval, or walked alone down a public street. The morning ritual begins with what the Edwardians called the presentation. Lady Ashworth's maid, Rebecca, has been awake since 4:30 preparing her mistress's appearance. Every curl must be perfectly positioned, every ribbon precisely tied, because a single detail out of place could destroy a family's reputation forever. In Edwardian society, appearance wasn't vanity, it was survival. One wrinkled dress at the wrong social gathering could mean exclusion from society, financial ruin, and social death. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in the kitchen, the real heart of the household beats with desperate urgency. Cook, her real name forgotten by everyone, including herself, commands an army of servants in preparing breakfasts for the family of 4. But this isn't just cooking, it's an elaborate theater of survival. Every egg must be boiled for exactly 3.5 minutes. Every piece of toast must be cut into identical triangles. The marmalade must be warmed to precisely the right temperature. Why? Because in the Edwardian world, perfection in the smallest details was the only thing standing between a servant and the workhouse. Here's the part that will send chills down your spine. The Ashworth children, 10-year-old Charles and 8-year-old Victoria, are being trained as instruments of this brutal system from the moment they can walk. Charles learns that he must never acknowledge a servant as a human being. To do so would be to betray his class and bring shame upon his family. Victoria learns that her worth as a woman depends entirely on her ability to marry well, which means she must master the art of saying absolutely nothing of substance while appearing charming and intelligent. But the morning holds a dark secret that reveals the true horror of Edwardian family life. As the family gathers for breakfast in their grand dining room, served by invisible hands on gleaming silver, they maintain perfect silence about the empty chair at the table. 3 months ago, their eldest son Edward died of tuberculosis, not because there was no cure, but because admitting illness existed would have meant social scandal. The family doctor was forbidden to speak of Edward's condition to anyone. Edward died in isolation, his own parents unable to comfort him for fear of appearing weak to their social circle. This is the reality that Edwardian families faced. They were trapped in a performance so demanding that it consumed not just their freedom, but often their lives. Lord Ashworth sits at the head of his table, reading his newspaper with apparent calm, but his hands shake slightly as he turns each page. He knows that his business, inherited from his father, is failing. The new industrial age is destroying the old ways of making money, but he cannot adapt because adaptation would mean admitting that the old ways were wrong. And in Edwardian society, admitting you were wrong about anything was admitting you had no right to your position in the hierarchy. The children eat their perfectly prepared breakfast in silence, trained never to speak unless spoken to, never to express a preference, never to show emotion. They are being molded into living sculptures of propriety, their natural curiosity and joy systematically crushed under the weight of expectation. Charles will be sent to boarding school in 2 months, where he'll learn that brutality toward those beneath him is not just acceptable, but required. Victoria will begin her training as a future wife, learning to play piano not for joy, but as a display of her family's wealth, learning to paint watercolors not for expression, but to prove she has enough leisure time to waste on useless accomplishments. The morning newspapers Lord Ashworth reads are filled with stories that reveal the true cost of this rigid system. Suicide rates among young women have reached epidemic proportions, daughters of good families choosing death over the suffocating expectations of marriage to men they've never been allowed to know. Mental institutions overflow with wives who dared to express opinions, labeled as hysterical and locked away by husbands who needed to maintain their reputations. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Edwardian family life was how it created monsters out of ordinary people. That same Lord Ashworth who trembles over his failing business will, in 2 hours, dismiss a parlour maid for the crime of looking directly at him while serving tea. Not because he's cruel by nature, but because cruelty toward servants is how he maintains his position in a system that's already marked him for destruction. The Ashworth family represents millions of families across Britain and America, caught in a social machine that promised elegance and delivered anxiety, that promised order and delivered chaos, that promised prosperity and delivered a slow-motion catastrophe that would culminate in the Great War. Every morning ritual, every carefully planned meal, every perfectly pressed dress was part of a desperate attempt to hold together a world that was already crumbling from within. As the family finishes breakfast and begins their separate days, Lord Ashworth to his failing business, Lady Margaret to her morning calls where she'll perform the same hollow conversations she's had for 20 years, the children to their lessons in becoming perfect replicas of their parents, the servants clear away the evidence of their meal and prepare for the next performance. Because in the Edwardian world, every moment was a performance, every breath was calculated, and every day brought them closer to a reckoning they could sense but never speak about. The morning has only just begun, and already the weight of Edwardian life presses down on every soul in the house. What happens next will reveal just how deep the cracks in this perfect facade really go, and how the simple act of living a single day in 1905 required a level of psychological endurance that would break most people living today. The Ashworth family thinks they're living in the pinnacle of civilization, but they're actually participants in one of history's most elaborate forms of collective self-destruction. 8-year-old Victoria Ashworth stands perfectly still as her governess, Miss Hartwell, strikes her knuckles with a wooden ruler for the 3rd time this morning. The crime? Victoria dared to ask. Why? When told she must never speak to the gardener's boy who waves at her from the window. But here's what Miss Hartwell doesn't know. Every night, Victoria sneaks to her bedroom window and uses a secret code of candle flashes to communicate with that same gardener's boy. In the suffocating world of Edwardian childhood, rebellion didn't die, it went underground, creating a hidden universe of resistance that would shock their parents to their very core. What you're about to discover will forever change how you see those innocent-looking children in old photographs, standing stiffly beside their parents in their pristine white dresses and sailor suits. Because behind those vacant, obedient expressions lay minds engaged in psychological warfare, hearts breaking under impossible expectations, and spirits finding ways to survive that were both ingenious and heartbreaking. The Edwardian era didn't just control children, it created an entire generation of secret rebels, and their hidden world was far more complex and dangerous than anyone imagined. Welcome to the real story of Edwardian childhood, where every smile was calculated, every tear was forbidden, and every moment of genuine joy had to be stolen in the shadows. This isn't the sanitized version you learned in history class. This is the truth about what happened when an entire society decided that children weren't human beings to be nurtured, but raw materials to be molded into perfect replicas of a dying world. Let's begin with the morning ritual that shaped every Edwardian child's relationship with their own identity. Victoria wakes at exactly 6 o'clock, not to an alarm, but to the sound of her governess entering the nursery. There are no good morning kisses, no warm embraces, no gentle awakening. Instead, Miss Hartwell immediately begins the daily inventory. Stand straight. Shoulders back. Chin parallel to the floor. Eyes forward. Today you will practice walking with books on your head for 30 minutes, followed by French conjugation, watercolor painting, and piano scales. You will speak only when spoken to, and you will remember that a lady's voice should never rise above a whisper. But here's the devastating part. Victoria has been receiving this exact same speech every morning for 4 years. She could recite it word for word. Yet she must stand there, at 8 years old, pretending to hear it for the first time, because showing familiarity would be showing disrespect, and disrespect meant punishment that could leave her isolated for days. The Edwardian system of child-rearing was built on a simple, terrifying principle. Children were born inherently evil and had to have their natural impulses systematically destroyed. Joy was selfishness. Curiosity was dangerous. Affection was weakness. Every natural instinct a child possessed was labeled as a character flaw that needed to be corrected through discipline, isolation, and shame. Victoria's brother Charles faces an even more brutal education in becoming what the Edwardians called a proper gentleman. At 10 years old, he's already learning that cruelty is not just acceptable, it's required. His tutor, Mr. Blackwood, begins each day by having Charles practice the look, a cold, dismissive expression that must be perfected before he can interact with anyone below his social class. Charles practices this look in the mirror each morning, watching his own face transform from a curious child into a miniature replica of his father's emotional emptiness. But Charles harbors a secret that would destroy his family's reputation if discovered. He's been teaching himself to read by sneaking books from the servants' quarters. Not the approved texts about duty and honor, but adventure stories, tales of exploration, books filled with characters who make their own choices and follow their own dreams. He hides these forbidden books inside his Latin grammar, reading about pirates and explorers while pretending to conjugate verbs. This small act of rebellion represents something revolutionary in the Edwardian world, a child choosing his own thoughts. The daily schedule for these children reads like a psychological torture manual disguised as education. 9 a.m. Deportment lessons, where Victoria learns to walk, sit, and stand in ways that deny every natural movement her body wants to make. 10 a.m. Conversation practice, where she learns to speak for hours without saying anything of substance, to appear interested while feeling nothing, to smile while her soul withers. 11 a.m. Watercolor painting, but not for creativity. She must copy the exact same landscape, in the same style, until her individual perspective is completely erased. Charles faces gentleman's education. That's designed to kill his empathy systematically. He's taught that servants aren't fully human, that women are inherently inferior, that anyone born to a lower class deserves their suffering. But here's the part that will break your heart. Charles knows this is wrong. At 10 years old, he can feel his natural compassion being murdered day by day, and he's powerless to stop it. The children's secret rebellion takes forms that would be invisible to their parents, but represent acts of extraordinary courage. Victoria has created an entire imaginary world where she's a detective solving mysteries, where she can ask questions and seek answers, where curiosity is rewarded instead of punished. She acts out these adventures in her mind during the endless hours of sitting silently while adults discuss her future, as if she were a piece of furniture to be sold. Charles has developed his own form of resistance. He deliberately fails at the lessons designed to make him cruel. When Mr. Blackwood tells him to practice dismissing servants with contempt, Charles secretly apologizes to them with his eyes. When he's supposed to learn to ignore the suffering of others, he finds small ways to help, leaving food where hungry servants will find it, accidentally, dropping coins where poor children can retrieve them. But the most heartbreaking aspect of Edwardian childhood was how it turned natural love into a source of shame and fear. Victoria loves her parents desperately, but she's been taught that showing this love is inappropriate, selfish, attention-seeking. She must earn their approval through perfect behavior, but the approval never comes because perfect behavior is simply expected, not rewarded. She lives in a constant state of anxiety, knowing that one mistake could result in being sent away to boarding school, effectively losing her family forever. The psychological damage this inflicted on children was staggering, but they found ways to heal each other in secret. Victoria and Charles have developed their own private language, a system of glances, small gestures, and carefully coded words that let them share their real thoughts and feelings without being detected. In the brief moments when their governess leaves the room, they whisper encouragement to each other, share their secret dreams, and promise that someday they'll escape this suffocating world. Here's what's truly remarkable. These children understood, with devastating clarity, that they were being prepared for a world that was dying. They could sense the artificial nature of their training, the disconnect between what they were learning and what they observed in the real world beyond their sheltered existence. Charles notices that his father's business associates speak differently when they think no children are listening, using words like crisis and collapse. Victoria overhears the servants talking about strikes and protests and changes coming that will turn everything upside down. The children are being trained for a world that may not exist by the time they reach adulthood, and somewhere in their developing minds they know it. This knowledge creates a peculiar kind of psychological pressure. They must perfect skills they suspect are useless, embrace values they intuitively reject, and prepare for a future that feels like a lie. The afternoon brings what the Edwardians called moral instruction, but what was actually systematic brainwashing designed to make children complicit in their own oppression. Victoria learns that her future happiness depends entirely on her ability to please a husband she's never met, who will be chosen for her based on financial considerations she's not allowed to understand. She's 8 years old, and she's already being taught that her own desires, preferences, and dreams are irrelevant to her life's purpose. Charles learns that his worth as a human being is determined by his ability to maintain his family's social position through whatever means necessary, including cruelty, exploitation, and the systematic oppression of anyone born to a lower class. He's being trained to become the kind of man who can destroy lives without feeling guilt, who can watch suffering without offering help, who can smile at dinner parties while his business practices create poverty and desperation. Lord Henry Blackmore adjusts his perfectly starched collar one final time before entering his drawing room, where 20 of London's most respectable families have gathered for afternoon tea. His smile is flawless, his posture impeccable, his conversation charming. But hidden in his jacket pocket is a suicide note he's rewritten 17 times this week. Tonight, after his guests leave, he plans to end his life rather than face the scandal that will destroy everything he's built. What his guests don't know is that half the people in this room are hiding secrets, so explosive that a single whispered word could topple the entire social order of Edwardian Britain. This is the story they never taught you in history class. The real story of what happened behind the mahogany doors and silk curtains of respectable society. Because while the Edwardian era presented itself as the pinnacle of moral civilization, it was actually built on lies so elaborate and secrets so dark that entire families lived in constant terror of exposure. What you're about to discover will shatter every romantic notion you've ever had about this supposedly golden age of propriety and grace. Welcome to a world where reputation was literally more valuable than life itself, where families would rather watch their children die than admit to illness, where the most respectable citizens were often the most depraved criminals, and where the beautiful facade of civilized society concealed a universe of blackmail, violence, corruption, and desperation that would make modern scandals look like children's games. Let's begin with the Blackmore family's terrible secret, the one that's driving Lord Henry towards suicide on this crisp October evening in 1907. 6 months ago, his eldest son Edmund returned from his grand tour of Europe, but he didn't return alone. Hidden in the servants' quarters of the Blackmore estate is a young Italian woman named Julia, pregnant with Edmund's child. In modern times, this might be embarrassing but manageable. In Edwardian society, it's a death sentence for the entire family's social standing. But here's where the story becomes truly horrifying. Lord Henry hasn't told his wife about Julia's existence. Instead, he's been slowly poisoning her with laudanum, planning to claim she died of a weak constitution. He's arranged for Julia to be shipped to an asylum in Scotland, where she'll be declared insane and locked away forever. The baby, if it survives, will be sold to a workhouse and disappear into the industrial machinery of poverty. 3 lives destroyed to protect her reputation. Yet even this monstrous plan pales compared to what's happening at the tea party upstairs. Lady Margaret Ashworth, the woman we met earlier, is engaged in conversation with Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton about charity work for orphans. What makes this exchange particularly chilling is that Mrs. Pemberton runs a network of brothels that specifically cater to men seeking children, and Lady Ashworth has been secretly supplying her with orphans from the charity in exchange for dirt on her husband's business rivals. These women discuss their transactions in a code so sophisticated that they could plan the sale of children while appearing to debate flower arrangements. The new roses from Surrey are particularly delicate this season. Means we have fresh young girls from the countryside. I do hope they'll survive the winter. Means make sure they don't live long enough to identify their clients. This conversation is happening in broad daylight, surrounded by the cream of society, over delicate china and perfectly baked scones. The Pemberton family's respectability is built on systematic horror that extends far beyond child trafficking. Mr. Pemberton's shipping company, celebrated for bringing exotic goods from the Empire, actually specializes in human cargo, not just the children for his wife's network, but entire families tricked into believing they're emigrating to better lives, only to find themselves sold into slavery in colonies where British law conveniently doesn't apply. The Pemberton drawing room, where charity committees meet to discuss helping the poor, is decorated with artifacts purchased with the proceeds of human misery. But perhaps the most sophisticated criminal enterprise belongs to Dr. Marcus Whitmore, whose presence at the tea party represents the ultimate corruption of trust. Dr. Whitmore is London's most respected physician, treating the city's elite families with care and discretion. His reputation for maintaining patient confidentiality is legendary. What his patients don't know is that he's been systematically murdering wealthy elderly patients and forging their wills to steal their fortunes, using his medical knowledge to make the deaths appear natural. Dr. Whitmore's method is diabolically clever. He convinces his elderly patients that they're suffering from rare tropical diseases that require complete isolation from family and friends. He moves them to his private clinic, where he slowly poisons them while extracting information about their financial assets. Over the past decade, he's murdered 43 people and stolen over £2 million, enough money to buy half of London. His victims' families actually thank him for his devoted care during their loved ones' final days. The web of corruption extends into every corner of respectable society. The Reverend James Morrison, who leads Sunday prayers for these same families, has been embezzling church funds to pay for his gambling debts and his addiction to opium. But his real crime is far worse. he's been selling information about his parishioners' private confessions to blackmailers and journalists. When wealthy families confess their sins seeking spiritual guidance, Reverend Morrison carefully documents every detail and sells it to the highest bidder. This creates a hellish cycle where families are forced to commit worse crimes to pay the blackmail for their previous crimes. Lord Blackmore's financial troubles began when Reverend Morrison sold information about Edmund's illegitimate child to a professional blackmailer named Thomas Crane. Crane has been extorting money from Lord Blackmore for months, which is why Lord Blackmore turned to murder as a solution. He simply ran out of money to pay for silence. The blackmail network operates like a sophisticated business enterprise. Thomas Crane maintains detailed files on every respectable family in London, cross-referencing their secrets to maximize leverage. He knows that Lady Ashworth is embezzling from orphan charities, that Mrs. Pemberton runs child brothels, that Dr. Whitmore is a serial killer, that Reverend Morrison is selling confessions. But instead of exposing them, he orchestrates their crimes to create more valuable secrets to sell. Crane's masterstroke is making his victims complicit in each other's crimes. He arranged for Lady Ashworth to supply children to Mrs. Pemberton's brothels, knowing that this would give him leverage over both women. He encouraged Dr. Whitmore to treat some of Crane's other blackmail victims, eliminating inconvenient witnesses while creating new income streams. The result is a criminal conspiracy so complex that exposing one person would bring down dozens of families. But the most heartbreaking aspect of these family secrets is how they destroy the innocent. Lord Blackmore's younger children have no idea why their father has become distant and cold, why their mother has begun taking strange medicines that make her sleep for days, why servants whisper and stop talking when they enter rooms. 10-year-old Charles and 8-year-old Victoria sense that something terrible is happening, but they're powerless to understand or help. The children develop their own theories about their parents' strange behavior. Charles believes his father is secretly ill and trying to hide it to spare the family worry. Victoria thinks her mother is sad because she lost a baby that no one talks about. They try to be extra good, extra quiet, extra perfect, hoping that somehow their behavior will fix whatever's wrong with their family. They don't know that their innocent attempts to help are actually making their parents' guilt and desperation worse. Lady Blackmore's descent into laudanum addiction creates its own spiral of family destruction. As the drug takes hold, she becomes increasingly paranoid and unpredictable. She accuses servants of stealing, children of plotting against her, her husband of trying to poison her, which, ironically, he actually is. Her behavior becomes so erratic that Lord Blackmore can claim her eventual death was caused by mental illness rather than murder. The social dynamics of Edwardian society made these criminal enterprises not just possible, but inevitable. The rigid class system meant that servants were invisible, their testimony worthless in court, their lives expendable. The emphasis on maintaining appearances meant that victims of crimes often couldn't report them without destroying their own reputations. The legal system was designed to protect property and reputation rather than human life, creating a perfect environment for sophisticated criminals to operate with impunity. Women were particularly vulnerable to exploitation because they had no legal rights independent of their husbands or fathers. Mrs. Pemberton's child trafficking network exploits this vulnerability. She specifically targets young women who have no family connections, no legal protection, no voice in society. Once these women disappear into her network, they simply cease to exist in any official sense. There are no missing person reports, no investigations, no consequences. The financial systems of the era also enabled massive fraud with minimal oversight. Dr. Whitmore's forgeries are possible because wealthy families often kept their financial affairs private, making it easy to claim that elderly patients had secretly changed their wills. The banking system relied on personal relationships and trust rather than systematic verification, allowing criminals like Whitmore to transfer stolen funds without detection. But perhaps the most enabling factor is the psychological pressure of maintaining respectability in Edwardian society. Families would rather endure ongoing victimization than risk social scandal by reporting crimes. When Lord Pemberton realizes that his business rivals are onto his human trafficking operation, he doesn't consider abandoning the criminal enterprise. Instead, he plans to murder the rivals and their families to protect his secret. The children of these families grow up in an atmosphere of constant tension and unspoken terror. They learn to read their parents' moods like weather patterns, becoming hypervigilant about detecting danger they can't understand. Charles Blackmore develops nervous habits, compulsive hand-washing, checking locks multiple times, startling at unexpected sounds. Victoria begins having nightmares about shadowy figures coming to take her family away. These children are being trained not just in proper etiquette and social graces, but in the art of keeping secrets they don't even know they're keeping. They learn that some topics make adults angry or frightened, that certain names cause conversations to stop, that asking too many questions brings punishment. They're being molded into the next generation of secret keepers, prepared to maintain the same systems of hidden corruption that are destroying their parents. The afternoon tea party continues its civilized facade while these undercurrents of corruption and desperation flow beneath every polite conversation. Lady Ashworth mentions that the weather has been unusually changeable lately, code for warning that police investigations are getting uncomfortably close to their operations. Mrs. Pemberton responds that she hopes the spring will bring more settled conditions, meaning she's arranging for several inconvenient witnesses to disappear permanently. Dr. Whitmore contributes that he's been treating several patients for similar seasonal ailments, his way of announcing that he's prepared to eliminate anyone who threatens the group's security. Reverend Morrison adds that he's been praying for the community's continued prosperity, meaning he's identified new targets for blackmail and extortion among his parishioners. The level of coordination required for these criminal enterprises reveals just how thoroughly corruption had penetrated Edwardian society. These aren't isolated cases of individual moral failure. They represent systematic criminal organizations operating at the highest levels of society, protected by the very institutions designed to maintain law and order. As the tea party winds down and guests prepare to return to their respective homes, each family carries with them the knowledge that their survival depends on the continued silence of people who have every reason to destroy them. Lord Blackmore returns to his study and the suicide note hidden in his desk, knowing that his death might be the only way to prevent his family's total destruction. But even in death, he can't escape. Thomas Crane has already prepared posthumous revelations that will ensure the Blackmore scandal continues to generate profit long after Lord Blackmore is gone. Lady Ashworth retreats to her morning room to write letters to her contacts in Scotland Yard, arranging for certain investigation files to disappear before they can threaten her operations. Mrs. Pemberton returns to her shipping office to personally oversee the loading of her next human cargo, children who will vanish into a system designed to erase their existence. Dr. Whitmore makes evening rounds to his elderly patients, carrying in his medical bag the poisons that will fund his lifestyle for another month. Reverend Morrison prepares Sunday's sermon about the importance of moral virtue and community trust, while planning how to exploit the confessions he'll hear after the service. The Edwardian age wasn't brought to an end by external forces like war or economic collapse. It was destroyed from within by the contradictions and corruptions that these family secrets represent. When the Great War finally came, it didn't create the moral crisis that destroyed the old order. It simply revealed the moral bankruptcy that had been hidden behind closed doors for decades. The children who survived this era of hidden horrors became the adults who rebuilt society after the war, carrying with them the knowledge that respectability could hide the most monstrous crimes, that institutions could be corrupted beyond recognition, that the people trusted to protect society could be its greatest threats. They created new systems designed to prevent the kinds of systematic abuse that had flourished in their parents' world. But the most lasting legacy of these Edwardian family secrets isn't the institutional changes they inspired. It's the recognition that every era's version of respectability and moral order conceals its own forms of corruption and exploitation. The perfectly maintained facades of Edwardian society collapsed not because they were attacked from outside, but because they were hollow from the beginning, supported only by the collective agreement to ignore the rot within. Tonight, as Lord Blackmore sits in his study contemplating suicide rather than facing exposure, as Lady Ashworth burns evidence of her crimes in her bedroom fireplace, as Mrs. Pemberton counts the profits from human misery, as Dr. Whitmore prepares his next murder, and as Reverend Morrison plans his next betrayal of trust, the foundations of their world are already crumbling. The secrets they've worked so hard to hide are becoming impossible to contain, and the very systems they've corrupted are turning against them. The Edwardian era's ultimate secret was that it was never as civilized as it appeared. It was simply more sophisticated in its barbarity, more elegant in its cruelty, more refined in its methods of exploitation. Behind every perfectly appointed drawing room, beneath every polite conversation, within every respectable family lay secrets dark enough to destroy not just individual reputations, but the entire social order they were designed to protect. Mary O'Sullivan stands in the kitchen at 3 a.m, her hands steady as she carefully measures rat poison into Lord Pemberton's morning tea. This isn't murder, it's justice. For 18 months, she's been gathering evidence of his crimes against children, documenting every visitor to his secret rooms, every payment to corrupt officials, every shipment of human cargo that leaves his docks. Tomorrow, when Lord Pemberton dies in apparent agony from a sudden illness, Mary will disappear into a network of former servants who have spent decades building an invisible army of resistance. What the wealthy families of Edwardian Britain never realized was that their servants weren't just watching, they were planning, organizing, and preparing for a war that would destroy the very foundations of the world that oppressed them. This is the untold story of the greatest espionage network in British history, operated not by governments or military forces, but by maids, footmen, cooks, and gardeners who turned their invisibility into the ultimate weapon. While their masters lived in blissful ignorance, believing their servants were simple-minded drudges grateful for employment, an elaborate underground resistance was documenting every crime, every weakness, every secret that could be used to bring down the system that treated human beings as disposable property. Welcome to the Invisible War, a decades-long campaign of sabotage, intelligence gathering, and strategic revenge that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of the Edwardian social order. What you're about to discover will forever change how you see those silent figures in the background of every historical photograph, standing motionless behind their wealthy employers. Because they weren't motionless at all. They were soldiers in a war their enemies never knew was being fought. Mary O'Sullivan's journey from terrified scullery maid to master assassin began 5 years ago, when she was 14, sold by her starving parents to Lord Pemberton's household for the price of a winter coat. Her first week in service taught her everything she needed to know about the true nature of Edwardian society. She watched Lord Pemberton's guests molest children barely older than herself, saw Lady Pemberton count money earned from human trafficking, witnessed the household dispose of bodies with the same casual efficiency they used to discard broken crockery. But Mary didn't break under this horror, she began to study it. During her few hours of rest each night, she started writing down everything she observed in a journal hidden beneath her mattress. Names, dates, amounts of money, descriptions of crimes, lists of victims. What she didn't know was that she was joining a tradition that stretched back generations, a secret society of servant spies who had been documenting the crimes of their masters since the Victorian era began. The network Mary discovered called itself the Invisible Parliament, and its reach extended far beyond anything the authorities could have imagined. In every great house across Britain, servants were secretly members of this organization, sharing information through a communication system so sophisticated that messages could travel from London to Edinburgh in less than a week. The network used flower delivery boys, traveling tinkers, market vendors, and railway workers to carry coded messages that looked like shopping lists or gossip but actually contained detailed intelligence about their employers' criminal activities. The Invisible Parliament's headquarters wasn't a building or office, it was a person. Sarah Henderson had served 40 years as a lady's maid to some of Britain's most powerful families before establishing herself as the network's central coordinator. Operating from a small boarding house in Whitechapel, she received reports from hundreds of servants across the country and maintained detailed files on every significant family in the British Empire. Her memory was legendary, She could recite from memory the financial dealings, sexual preferences, political connections, and criminal activities of over 3,000 individual aristocrats and wealthy merchants. But Sarah Henderson's greatest achievement was creating the network's recruitment and training system. New servants weren't simply given information and sent into dangerous situations. They underwent months of preparation that would rival any modern intelligence agency. They learned to read and write using materials stolen from their employers' libraries. They memorized codes for transmitting information safely. They studied the personalities and weaknesses of specific target families. Most importantly, they learned to think strategically about how individual pieces of information could be combined to maximum effect. The training Mary received reveals the sophistication of the servant resistance. She learned that a master's choice of wine could reveal his financial situation. Desperate men drank cheaper vintages but tried to hide the labels. She discovered that the timing of family arguments often correlated with business problems or extramarital affairs that could be exploited. She was taught to recognize the symptoms of various diseases and poisons, knowledge that would prove useful both for protecting herself and eliminating threats to the network. Perhaps most importantly, Mary learned the network's cardinal rule: never act alone, never act impulsively, and never act without considering the consequences for other servants. The invisible parliament had survived for decades by thinking collectively rather than seeking individual revenge. Every action was planned to protect the network while advancing their larger strategic goals. The network's first major victory came in 1902 when they orchestrated the downfall of Lord Ashford, a particularly vicious master who had been responsible for the deaths of dozens of servants through overwork, punishment, and deliberate neglect. Rather than simply murdering him, which would have brought investigations that could expose other network members, they executed a campaign of systematic sabotage that destroyed his reputation, his business, and his family's social standing. The campaign began with his cook, Elizabeth Morris, gradually poisoning him with small doses of mercury that caused memory loss, paranoia, and erratic behavior. Simultaneously, his valet, James Crawford, began selling information about Lord Ashford's business dealings to his competitors while making it appear that Lord Ashford was betraying his own partners. The housemaids systematically stole and planted evidence that made Lord Ashford appear to be embezzling from charities and cheating at cards. The coordination required for this operation reveals the network's military-level organizational capabilities. Elizabeth Morris had to time her poisoning schedule to coordinate with James Crawford's intelligence operations and the housemaids' evidence planting. Messages were passed between them using a system of marks left on shared surfaces. A specific arrangement of kitchen utensils meant increase the dosage, while certain flower arrangements in the hallway signaled abort the operation. The result was devastating for Lord Ashford but appeared entirely natural to outside observers. His increasingly erratic behavior alienated his business partners, who began investigating his finances and discovered the planted evidence of embezzlement. His paranoid accusations against his servants led to public scenes that destroyed his reputation for gentlemanly behavior. His memory problems caused him to make contradictory statements about his business dealings, leading to lawsuits that bankrupted him. Within 18 months, Lord Ashford went from being one of London's most powerful men to a broken, impoverished exile living in a boarding house, abandoned by his family and friends. He died alone and forgotten, never knowing that his destruction had been orchestrated by the servants he had treated as subhuman. The network's files record this operation as a complete success. Not only was a monster eliminated, but no servant was harmed and no suspicion fell on the invisible parliament. The success of the Ashford operation established the network's reputation amongst servants throughout Britain. Recruitment exploded as word spread that resistance was not only possible but effective. The network's membership grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands, creating an intelligence apparatus that penetrated every level of British society. The network's information-gathering capabilities became so sophisticated that they often knew about their masters' criminal activities before the criminals themselves fully understood what they were doing. Servants working for different members of criminal conspiracies would compare notes and piece together patterns that individual conspirators couldn't see. This intelligence advantage allowed the network to anticipate and counter threats while positioning themselves to exploit opportunities for revenge. Mary O'Sullivan's assignment to the Pemberton household represented the network's most ambitious operation yet. Lord Pemberton's child trafficking network was so extensive and well protected that conventional law enforcement couldn't touch it. But the invisible Parliament had been gathering evidence for years, documenting not just Pemberton's crimes but the entire conspiracy that included police officials, judges, politicians, and foreign agents. Mary's role was to serve as the final witness, gathering the last pieces of evidence needed to expose the entire network while positioning herself to eliminate key conspirators who couldn't be prosecuted due to their political connections. Her 18 months in the Pemberton household had been a masterclass in intelligence gathering under extreme pressure. The evidence Mary collected reveals the true scope of Edwardian criminal enterprises. Lord Pemberton's operation wasn't just selling children for sexual exploitation. It was part of an international network that included slavery, drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and political corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. The Invisible Parliament's investigation had uncovered connections between British aristocrats and criminal organizations operating in India, South Africa, Australia, and Canada. But gathering evidence was only half of Mary's mission. The network had also tasked her with eliminating specific targets whose deaths would cripple the criminal organization while appearing to be natural causes. The rat poison in Lord Pemberton's tea was just the beginning of a campaign that would systematically eliminate 12 key conspirators over the following 6 months. The sophistication of these assassinations reveals how the network had evolved from simple resistance to professional intelligence operations. Mary had been trained in the use of various poisons, each chosen for specific effects and detection profiles. Lord Pemberton would die of apparent heart failure caused by strychnine, but the symptoms would mimic a condition he was already known to suffer from. His death would trigger predetermined responses from other network members in different households, creating a cascading series of eliminations that would appear unconnected to outside investigators. The network's communication systems had also evolved to handle increasingly complex operations. Messages were now embedded in everything from sheet music to knitting patterns to flower arrangements delivered to specific addresses. A particular hymn played at church could signal the beginning of an operation, while the absence of certain flowers in a garden arrangement could indicate that plans had changed. The psychological warfare component of the network's operations was perhaps their most devastating weapon. Servants who had spent years observing their masters' fears, insecurities, and psychological weaknesses could manipulate them with surgical precision. They knew exactly which fears to exploit, which relationships to undermine, which memories to trigger to drive their targets towards self-destruction. Mary's campaign against the Pemberton household included systematic psychological torture designed to drive Lady Pemberton insane, while making Lord Pemberton increasingly paranoid and isolated. She rearranged objects in ways that would make Lady Pemberton question her memory, planted evidence that suggested Lord Pemberton was planning to have her killed, and gradually altered their medication to increase anxiety and paranoia. The goal wasn't just revenge. It was to create conditions where the criminal organization would collapse from internal conflict before the network needed to resort to more direct action. By the time Mary administered the final dose of poison to Lord Pemberton, he was already so isolated and paranoid that his death would be seen as almost inevitable by those who knew him. The broader strategy of the Invisible Parliament was to systematically destroy the social and economic foundations that enabled wealthy families to exploit servants with impunity. They understood that individual acts of revenge, while satisfying, wouldn't change the system that created new victims every day. Instead, they focused on operations that would undermine the entire structure of Edwardian society. The network's economic warfare was particularly sophisticated. Servants with access to financial information would coordinate market manipulations that destroyed their masters' investments, while enriching network members who had established their own financial operations. They knew which businesses were overleveraged, which investments were fraudulent, which partnerships were unstable. This information allowed them to trigger financial collapses that appeared to be natural market forces but were actually carefully orchestrated attacks. The network also engaged in systematic industrial sabotage designed to cripple businesses that relied on servant labor. Factory owners who treated workers like slaves would find their machinery mysteriously breaking down, their supply chains disrupted, their quality control compromised. The sabotage was subtle enough to appear like normal operational problems, but systematic enough to destroy profitability and force businesses into bankruptcy. Perhaps most importantly, the network worked to protect and rescue other servants from the worst abuses of the system. They maintained safe houses where servants could escape violent masters, established employment networks that helped victims find better situations, and created financial support systems for servants who were injured or disabled in service. The rescue operations were often the most dangerous missions the network undertook. Extracting a servant from a hostile household required careful timing, reliable transportation, false identities, and safe destinations. The network developed techniques for forging employment references, creating false backgrounds, and establishing new identities that could withstand investigation by suspicious employers. Mary O'Sullivan's extraction from the Pemberton household after completing her mission demonstrates the network's operational sophistication. Within hours of Lord Pemberton's death, she had been replaced by a network member who would continue gathering evidence while Mary disappeared into a new identity. The replacement servant had been trained to perfectly mimic Mary's speech patterns, work habits, and personality traits, ensuring that other household members wouldn't notice the substitution during the chaos following Lord Pemberton's death. The network's long-term strategy was to create conditions that would make the traditional master-servant relationship economically and socially unsustainable. They understood that the Edwardian system depended on a large population of desperate people willing to accept degrading treatment in exchange for basic survival. By providing alternatives and raising the costs of exploiting servants, they could force the system to evolve or collapse. This strategy was remarkably successful. By 1910, many wealthy families were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain large household staffs. Servants were becoming more demanding about working conditions, more likely to leave abusive situations, more willing to organize collectively for better treatment. What appeared to be natural social evolution was actually the result of decades of careful planning and strategic action by the invisible Parliament. The network's intelligence operations also contributed to larger historical changes that are usually attributed to other causes. Information gathered by servant spies was often passed to journalists, politicians, and social reformers who used it to expose corruption and advocate for change. The network's documentation of child labor abuses, industrial safety violations, and political corruption provided the evidence needed to support reform movements that might otherwise have lacked credible information. The relationship between the invisible Parliament and legitimate reform movements was complex and carefully managed. The network couldn't openly ally with reformers without exposing their members to retaliation, but they could provide information and support in ways that appeared coincidental. A reformer might receive anonymous tips about specific abuses, or find that witnesses were surprisingly willing to testify about previously hidden crimes. The network's operations during the period leading up to World War I revealed their understanding that major social changes were approaching that would fundamentally alter the master-servant relationship. Rather than simply reacting to these changes, they positioned themselves to influence and accelerate the transformation of British society. As war approached and traditional social structures began to break down, the network's members were prepared to take advantage of new opportunities. Many servants left domestic service for better-paying factory jobs, while others used skills learned through network training to establish their own businesses. The network's financial operations, built on decades of carefully managed investments funded by their master's wealth, provided capital for members to purchase property and start enterprises that would have been impossible under the old system. Mary O'Sullivan's story after leaving the Pemberton household illustrates the transformation that network membership could provide. Using skills learned during her years as a servant spy, she established herself as a private investigator specializing in cases involving wealthy families. Her knowledge of how great houses operated, combined with her contacts throughout the servant network, made her extraordinarily effective at uncovering secrets that other investigators couldn't access. The irony is that Mary's former oppressors now paid handsomely for the same investigative skills they had unwittingly helped her develop while she served in their households. The wealthy families who had treated servants as invisible property now found themselves dependent on those same servants' knowledge and abilities to solve their most pressing problems. The network's greatest achievement was not any single operation or campaign, but the creation of a generation of former servants who understood that they were not naturally inferior to their former masters. The psychological transformation from seeing themselves as grateful dependents to recognizing themselves as skilled professionals with valuable knowledge was perhaps more revolutionary than any act of sabotage or revenge. By 1914, the traditional Edwardian household was becoming economically unsustainable, not because of external economic forces, but because the servant class had organized itself into an effective resistance movement that made exploitation increasingly costly and difficult. The network had achieved its ultimate goal, the destruction of a system that treated human beings as disposable property. The outbreak of World War I accelerated changes that the Invisible Parliament had been working toward for decades. As men left for military service and women entered factories, the rigid social hierarchies that had enabled systematic exploitation began to collapse. Former servants found themselves in positions of authority and responsibility that would have been unthinkable under the old system. But the network's influence didn't end with the war. Many of its members became leaders in the labor movements, social reform organizations, and political parties that shaped post-war Britain. The intelligence-gathering skills, organizational abilities, and strategic thinking they had developed as servant spies made them extraordinarily effective advocates for social justice and economic equality. The story of the Invisible Parliament reveals that the transformation of British society wasn't simply the result of external forces like industrialization and war, but the outcome of decades of careful planning and coordinated action by people who were supposedly powerless to change their circumstances. The servants who appeared to be passive victims of an oppressive system were actually active agents of its destruction. Mary O'Sullivan's final act as a member of the network was to help establish schools that would teach former servants the skills they needed to succeed in the changing economy. These schools, funded by wealth that had been systematically extracted from exploitative employers over decades, provided education, training, and support that enabled thousands of people to escape poverty and build better lives for their families. The ultimate victory of the Invisible Parliament wasn't revenge against individual oppressors, but the creation of a society where the kind of systematic exploitation they had experienced became impossible to sustain. They had fought an invisible war and won a victory so complete that future generations would forget that the war had ever been fought. The servants had become invisible not because they were powerless, but because their power was so effective that it transformed the world without leaving obvious traces of their influence. Tonight, as Mary O'Sullivan watches Lord Pemberton die from the poison she administered, she knows that she is witnessing not just the death of one man, but the end of an entire world. The system that had treated her as disposable property had been systematically dismantled by people it never recognized as threats. The invisible war was ending, and the servants had won. They moved like shadows in polished shoes. Silent hands folding linen napkins, drawing back velvet drapes, pouring tea with a grace so smooth it seemed invisible. The Edwardian servant was trained to vanish in plain sight. But behind every perfectly served dinner, every gleaming silver tray, every bowed head, there pulsed a quiet war. This was a world of locked doors, both literal and metaphorical. Upstairs, the masters smiled with champagne and scandal. Downstairs, resentment simmered in the cramped corridors behind the scullery. And sometimes, it boiled over. Imagine waking before sunrise every day of your life just to polish someone else's boots. Imagine being scolded for the angle of a teaspoon, or the crease in a newspaper. Imagine cleaning a room you would never be allowed to sit in, touching silk gowns you could never dream of owning, dusting portraits of people who would never learn your name. Now imagine doing it in silence. No anger, no outburst. Only obedience. Or so it seemed. But behind that silence, servants spoke in glances. In coughs. In codes. There were entire conversations carried by the way someone folded a bedsheet. A slipped note. A door left ajar. Below the grand houses of Edwardian Britain, there was an entire underground language of resistance and survival. It started with the youngest footman, boys barely 17, who learned quickly that the real rulebook wasn't written in ink. The real rules were whispered over laundry tubs, behind pantry doors, or in the stiff air of servant halls, long after the masters had gone to bed. It was there that a new maid might be warned quietly. Never be alone with the second son. Or, don't trust cook when she's drinking. They had to help each other. Because no one else would. The law didn't care about a scullery maid who bruised her wrist escaping a master's hand. Newspapers wouldn't print the story of a valet dismissed without pay after discovering too much. And so they created their own justice. Their own protection. Their own secret world. Revenge was rarely loud. It was a dash of salt in the sugar jar. A silk shirt ruined just slightly with too much starch. Letters misplaced. Timetables accidentally forgotten. Sometimes it was a lie whispered into the right ear at the right moment. A dropped word. A smile that said nothing, but meant everything. And yes, some servants gathered secrets like coins. They became quiet collectors of weakness. A love letter here. A ledger entry there. The mistress's bottle of laudanum, hidden in the drawer. The master's debts, whispered behind his back. For every cruelty inflicted upstairs, something was quietly filed away downstairs. Until one day, it could be used. Some sold the secrets. Some traded them. And some, those with fire in their bellies, used them to bring the entire house down. But not all battles were fought with spite. Many were about survival. The cooks shared scraps with the scullery maids. Butlers gave safe signals to warn of a master's rage. Housemaids pooled their few pennies to send a friend to the doctor in secret. And sometimes, when a servant fell pregnant by one of the sons of the house, it was other servants who helped her vanish before the scandal reached daylight. This invisible economy of care was stitched into every moment. It wasn't just kindness, it was strategy. Because one slip, one wrong move, and a servant could be turned out into the street with nothing. No references, no savings, no future. But together, they could at least cushion the fall. And when alliances deepened, so did the power. A senior maid might quietly slip into the drawing room while the family was away, not to clean, but to photograph a letter left on the desk. She wouldn't sell it yet. No. She'd keep it, tucked in her apron. A silent shield. Because one day, if she was accused, dismissed, threatened, she would have something the family couldn't deny. Others went further. There are documented cases, buried in dusty archives, of valets who became blackmailers. Housekeepers who knew too much and made sure the masters knew it. Even chauffeurs who watched and waited until they could expose affairs, secret debts, or political crimes. They were not just servants. They were spies with nothing to lose and everything to gain. But with every act of resistance came danger. One whisper overheard could mean the end. Servants who crossed the line too obviously found themselves locked out with no warning, their trunks thrown into the street. And yet some chose to risk everything. Why? Because under all the obedience and precision lay something raw and human, dignity. Pride. A sense that no one, not even the most powerful aristocrat, could truly own them. It's easy to romanticize the past, to picture a Downton Abbey world of elegant hierarchy and polite conversation. But the reality was more brutal, more fragile, and far more alive. There were rivalries downstairs too. Maids who betrayed each other to curry favor, footmen who used gossip as a weapon. Not every servant was noble. Not every act of sabotage was just. Sometimes, jealousy destroyed friendships. Sometimes the invisible war turned inward. And yet, within that brutal system, there bloomed moments of incredible strength. A maid who escaped and started a boarding house for other former servants. A butler who used his insider knowledge to become a private investigator. A nanny who secretly taught the cook's daughter to read using discarded newspapers. They found ways to resist the narrative that they were nothing. That their lives were worth less than the china they polished. And they did it not with rebellion in the streets, but rebellion in the shadows. They cooked revenge into puddings. They ironed spite into collars. They smiled as they plotted. Because the greatest power a servant could hold was knowing something their master didn't. And the longer they stayed, the more they knew. Every whisper, every keyhole, every late-night argument heard through a wall, it all became currency. Some servants passed these stories down like legends. Tales of a housemaid who stole her mistress's jewelry, only to return it piece by piece as penance. Of a valet who sabotaged a nobleman's engagement by revealing a long-lost scandal. Of a footman who vanished with a family's fortune and was never caught. And always, these stories ended with the same chilling truth. In the Edwardian household, the ones who knew the most were the ones you never saw. They called it the Golden Age, the twilight of elegance, the final glitter of an empire at its peak. But if you looked closely, beneath the marble, behind the manners, you could see the cracks spreading, hairline fractures in the foundation of the Edwardian dream. To the outside world, it all looked immaculate. Horse-drawn carriages shared the streets with early motorcars. Society ladies shimmered in silk beside suffragettes in boots. There were garden parties and champagne, grand tours and orchestras. But no one noticed, or wanted to notice, that the whole thing was balanced on a cliff's edge. Servants noticed first. They always do. They saw the unpaid bills hidden under inkwells. They overheard the panicked whispers about falling stock prices. They carried notes between mistresses and bankers, between daughters and lovers, and sometimes, between spies. They saw the desperation behind the powdered smiles. Because behind the luxury was rot. Industrial progress had made things faster, cheaper, louder. But it had also displaced thousands. Machines didn't get tired. Machines didn't ask for a raise. Machines didn't strike. The very technology that filled mansions with electricity and hot water was also emptying the countryside of jobs. Coal mines closed. Farmhands vanished. Railways connected cities, but tore through communities like steel knives. And while the upper classes admired the hum of new gadgets, the lower classes were left staring at silent factories and shrinking wages. The cities swelled. Slums festered in the shadows of opera houses. A child could starve in the same street where a duke's dog wore a diamond collar. There were families living 10 to a room, coughing blood into cloth napkins stolen from work. And above them, the ballroom lights glowed warm and golden. No one looked down. But pressure builds. By 1905, workers were striking in railways, docks, coalfields. Riots broke out over food prices. Even in the country estates, rumors began to circulate. Servants whispered of revolutions in Russia, of bombs in the post, of anarchists hiding in London crowds. The masters laughed. The newspapers dismissed it. But fear had begun to stain the linen. And still, the illusion held. Lavish garden parties continued, even as the stock market wobbled. Aristocrats poured fortunes into exotic investments, speculative schemes, and bubbles that grew too large, too fast. One by one, they began to burst. Behind closed doors, some families were selling heirlooms to pay off quiet debts. Others sent their sons to America, chasing railroads and oil fields. The old money was draining, and the new money, brash, unrefined, unapologetically industrial, was replacing them. This was more than a shift in wealth. It was the death of a worldview. You could see it in the architecture, Edwardian houses trying to imitate Victorian majesty, but without the same conviction. You could feel it in the letters, longing for a past that had already slipped away. You could hear it in the music, romantic, melancholic, filled with crescendos that never quite resolved. The old class system still wore its mask, but the eyes behind it were afraid. And in the drawing rooms of those vast country homes, daughters were starting to speak, asking questions, refusing proposals, reading dangerous books. Servants began to vanish in the night, some to the city, others to organize, a few even to join political movements that dreamed of burning the system down. By 1910, there were more signs. A king died suddenly. The Titanic, a floating cathedral to Edwardian arrogance, sank into black water. A symbol, too perfect to be ignored. And still, the parties continued. But the war was coming. Not just any war. Not a skirmish in a far colony or a rebellion easily crushed. This would be something bigger. Something that would rip the continent in half. You could feel it in the air, though no one said it aloud. Europe was a chessboard with too many kings. And the pawns were waking up. When war finally came in 1914, it didn't arrive with ceremony. It arrived like a scream breaking a waltz. Suddenly, the sons of noble families were dying in mud. Entire fortunes vanished in the time it took for a telegram to arrive. Servants who had once buttoned coats were now shooting rifles. Masters who had never lifted a tool were forced to wait in ration lines. The hierarchy cracked. And by the end of it, those who survived knew. The Edwardian age was never golden. It was brass polished to a mirror shine. Beautiful. Fragile. And ultimately hollow. When the soldiers came back, those who came back, they found a different world. Women had worked in factories, driven ambulances, voted. Some refused to return to silence. The servants didn't come back either, not in the same way. They had seen the world burn. They would not go back to polishing silver for men who had wept in trenches. The great estates, once full of laughter and clinking glasses, began to fall quiet. Rooms were closed. Wings were sealed off. Families sold land, moved abroad, vanished. What was once seen as timeless, the rituals, the classes, the codes, was now seen as a relic. A ghost. And yet, doesn't it feel familiar? A society that dances while it burns. That praises progress, but ignores its victims. That builds towers while the foundations crack. We think we are different. Smarter. Safer. But we still build golden ages on borrowed time. We still tell ourselves the cracks are nothing. That the system will hold. That this party will last. But history whispers otherwise. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear it. The sound of footsteps leaving through the servants' entrance. The silence that comes before the storm. The moment when a golden age finally admits what it always was. An illusion. They lived in the shadows of fortunes they would never touch. Behind the heavy doors of Edwardian mansions, past the marbled halls and velvet chairs, there existed another economy. One built not on gold, but on favors, instincts, and quiet deals struck in the dark. To the family upstairs, the servants were an expense. Uniforms, wages, room and board. To the world outside, they were invisible. But to each other, they were everything. Because when your entire life could be undone by a bad reference, a whisper, or a single mistake, survival wasn't just personal. It had to be communal. So they built a second world. A mirror world. It began with the basics. Leftovers, for instance, were gold. A slice of ham from a half-eaten plate, bread untouched by guests, an apple taken before it bruised. The cook might, accidentally, prepare too much. The kitchen maid would forget to lock the larder. These weren't accidents. These were arrangements. Food flowed sideways, not down. Maids didn't always eat what they were given, they traded. A half bottle of sherry filched from a careless butler might become soap from the laundry maid. A jar of preserved peaches. taken during a delivery, before inventory was noted, could buy you silence, or protection, or kindness on a cold morning. Nothing was wasted. Every crumb, every thread, every spare candle had value. Because upstairs, wealth made things disposable. But downstairs, survival made everything precious. Even time was currency. A footman might take a morning shift for a scullery maid who hadn't slept. In return, she'd help him polish his shoes before inspection. These trades formed webs, some practical, some emotional. And once you were in the web, you stayed. The strongest servants didn't rise by brute strength or cleverness alone. They thrived because they understood the value of loyalty. And sometimes, just sometimes, they wielded it like a knife. There were rules. Unspoken ones. If you betrayed someone within the web, you could be frozen out. Not by the family, but by the people who mattered, the ones who knew when the master was drunk, or when the nanny was ill, or when the mistress would sleep late. You don't want to be alone in the servants' hall. You don't want to carry secrets without protection. You don't want to lose the economy of care. And it wasn't just about goods. Information was traded like gold. A new housemaid with experience in another estate might be asked, quietly, "What's their routine? Do they tip? Do they favor girls with freckles?" Information helped you survive. It warned you who to avoid, who to befriend, when to disappear from a room. And then there were the secret markets. Some butlers took tips not to the master, but directly into their own pockets. Laundry maids sometimes lost a pair of stockings, only to sell them in a nearby market the following week. Kitchen boys occasionally sold herbs, flour, or sugar, just enough that no one noticed. A few brave ones brewed gin in basements, trading it for boots, favors, or silence. Outside the house, street vendors knew which servants would come with silver buttons to trade, or ribbons stolen from the mistress's vanity. Pawn shops quietly accepted items with no questions asked. And if you were clever enough, you could build a fortune, slowly, out of scraps. One maid was said to have worn discarded jewelry under her uniform for years, collecting it piece by piece. Another used cast-off silks to sew dresses, selling them in secret to a dressmaker who thought she was an assistant, not a servant. One former footman became a landlord by saving every tip he earned and investing it through a cousin. Of course, these were the lucky ones. The bold. Most didn't dream so high. But even the smallest act could be an act of defiance. An extra spoonful of sugar in your tea. A nap taken in the linen closet when no one was looking. A glance at yourself in the master's mirror before turning away. And always the web grew. Sometimes it extended beyond the house. A servant dismissed from one estate might carry news about a cruel mistress, a dishonest cook, a gentleman who touched the maids. These stories traveled faster than telegrams. They crossed counties, cities, and in the great, whispered map of servantdom, reputations mattered. You didn't want to be the maid who betrayed another. You didn't want to be the butler who beat the scullery boy. Because long after the family forgot you, the servants would remember. There were networks of support, especially for women. Midwives who specialized in quiet arrangements. Boarding houses run by former housekeepers, offering shelter to girls who'd got in trouble. Some homes even had secret codes scratched under floorboards or inside cupboards, signs that a maid once trusted had left her mark, had survived. These weren't just acts of charity. They were part of the unwritten code: help each other, because no one else will. Even illness became part of the network. Servants couldn't afford doctors. So the older maids passed down remedies, tricks, herbs. A poultice made from onions. A syrup of boiled rose hips. A secret tea that would bring a period on early, or stop one from coming at all. And then there were the letters. Servants wrote constantly. To siblings in other houses, to lovers they weren't allowed to marry, to mothers they hadn't seen in years. These letters carried more than news. They carried warnings, openings, opportunities. Some servants moved from house to house not randomly, but by invitation. A whispered note. The house on Hill Street is hiring. The mistress sleeps late. You'll be safe. And sometimes, revenge was arranged by letter, too. A dismissed maid might write to her friend, now employed in the same house. Don't let them touch you. Tell cook about the mistress's bottles. Hide your tips. This was how the servant class fought back. Not with open rebellion, but with threads. Thousands of invisible threads, connecting kitchen maids to valets, footmen to laundresses, cooks to coachmen. Together, they wove a net strong enough to catch each other when they fell. They didn't wait for justice. They made their own. Sometimes, that justice came with a cost. One housemaid was caught selling the mistress's old hats, and was whipped in the cellar before being thrown into the street. Another was accused of theft, though no one could prove it, and found herself blacklisted in every estate for 50 miles. But some got away with it. Some thrived. A valet who knew too many secrets was quietly paid to leave, and used that money to open a pub, hiring only ex-servants. A former kitchen girl married a wealthy grocer after impressing his mother with her sauces. A governess who'd once been beaten for correcting the master's son became a teacher and raised an entire generation of girls who didn't know how to curtsy, and didn't care. These victories were rare. But they mattered. Because every time one servant escaped, every time one person proved the system wasn't invincible, it sent a message to the rest. You are not powerless. They may own the walls, but you know where the walls crack. They may have the keys, but you know where the locks are soft. They may give the orders, but you decide how those orders are carried out, and what price they pay if they aren't careful. And even when the masters thought themselves untouchable, the smart ones always watched the servants with quiet fear. Because deep down, they knew the truth. No empire survives when its foundations walk away. No power is absolute when the powerless are watching. And no golden age lasts when the people holding the plates have stopped believing in it. They weren't supposed to fall in love. Not here. Not like this. Not between booths and basins, under gaslight and silence. But they did. In the servant quarters of Edwardian houses, romance didn't come with flowers or love letters. It came in whispers. In a brush of fingers passing silverware. In a look held 1 second too long as candles were snuffed. It came where it shouldn't. Between shifts. Between orders. Beneath the rules. Because everything about service was designed to erase desire. Uniforms that covered the skin. Hours that left no time to dream. Rooms that barely fit one bed, let alone two. Love was a luxury they weren't meant to have, which made it burn hotter. They called it below stairs, but it might as well have been another planet. Upstairs, the family waltzed and dined and married for alliances. Downstairs, servants found each other in dark corners, in laundry rooms thick with steam, in the stillness between midnight and dawn. And what they found was messy, risky, and often forbidden. A maid caught kissing a footman could be dismissed by morning. A kitchen boy caught sneaking into a scullery girl's room might find himself beaten, or worse, accused of assault, no matter the truth. But they did it anyway. Because in a world where everything was owned, your time, your body, your silence, love was the only thing you could still steal. Some romances were sweet. Quiet glances during chapel. Notes tucked into coat pockets. A stolen hour on Sunday afternoon walking by the river, pretending not to notice the glares of strangers who knew exactly who they were and what they couldn't have. Others were dangerous. Valets seducing housemaids, not out of affection, but to control them. Older servants using power to demand obedience in the name of affection. Some girls said yes to avoid being turned out. Others said no and vanished within a week. Then there were the affairs that crossed class lines, servants and masters. The most dangerous love of all. There are stories buried in dusty letters, hinted at in diary entries, never spoken aloud. A lady's maid who bore the master's child and was paid to disappear. A young lord who fell in love with the kitchen boy and was quietly sent to the colonies. A scullery maid found weeping in the garden, dismissed for impertinence, after the mistress discovered her perfume on the master's collar. The official histories don't talk about these things, but the walls remember. The back stairs creaked in certain places. The linen closet had scratches in the wood where lovers clutched in silence. The pantry door never shut properly after it was slammed during a jealous fight between a footman and a page. The stories are there, if you listen. And sometimes, they ended in tragedy. One love affair between a nursemaid and a gardener ended when the girl was found pregnant. He was dismissed. She was kept just long enough to serve breakfast, then thrown out into the rain. No reference. No shelter. No name left behind. Another footman took his life after being accused of improper conduct. The accusation came from a fellow servant, some say out of jealousy, others say it was a lie planted by the mistress herself, who feared his affection for her daughter had become too obvious. But love refused to die. Some couples married in secret. Some fled the estate and started new lives in cities where no one cared who they had served. A few returned years later, now dressed in finer clothes, pretending not to recognize the faces that once sneered at them in hallways. And love wasn't always romantic. Sometimes it was fierce friendship, two maids protecting each other from the master's gaze. A cook shielding the kitchen girl who couldn't stop crying. A butler quietly giving a boy extra shifts so he wouldn't be alone at night. These bonds were deeper than duty. They were lifelines. And they made the house dangerous in a way the family never understood. Because once you have love, you start to believe in yourself. And once you believe in yourself, obedience dies. Some love affairs became alliances. A maid in love with a valet might slip him the mistress's letters. A kitchen boy enamored with the housemaid might cover for her while she sneaked away to meet someone upstairs. These weren't just passions, they were weapons. Secrets shared in the dark could one day shatter a house. And in some homes they did. One scandal erupted when a governess discovered that the first footman was secretly engaged to the under housemaid. The mistress forbade it. The staff rebelled. Over a dozen left in a single week, leaving the house paralyzed. The couple married anyway. Another tale tells of a wealthy family whose heir ran away with the cook's daughter. She was educated, clever, and pregnant. They married. The family disowned him. A year later, he returned to buy back the estate, with money earned not from his inheritance, but from a business she built with recipes stolen from the manor kitchen. And beneath these dramatic stories, everyday love still bloomed in quiet. Two housemaids sharing a room, pretending to be just friends. A stable boy leaving wildflowers in the scullery sink each morning. A former servant visiting an old love every Sunday, never going past the gate, just standing outside until she opened the window and smiled. These weren't fairy tales. They were survival. When your world offers you no softness, no choice, no future, love becomes rebellion. Even the bitter loves mattered. The ones that ended in heartbreak, or betrayal, or silence. Because every affair, every glance, every breathless risk carved a crack in the system. A reminder that no matter how tightly the class machine squeezed, it couldn't crush the human heart. And love had memory. Decades later, former servants would sit by fires, telling stories to grandchildren. Not about kings or wars, but about the man who left her a rose under the stairwell. About the girl who never came back after the snow. About the laughter in the hallway when no one was watching. The families they once served had their names carved in stone. But the servants? They carried their names in stories. In kisses stolen at dusk. In laughter echoing through locked corridors. And perhaps that's the most enduring rebellion of all. Because systems fall. Houses crumble. Bloodlines fade. But the hand that reached for another hand in the dark? That moment lives forever. Secrets weren't just dangerous in Edwardian houses. They were currency. And no one held more of them than the ones who moved like ghosts between the rooms, who listened while pretending not to, who folded shame into napkins and swept scandal under carpets. The servants saw everything. They were there when the master staggered in after midnight, reeking of someone else's perfume. They were there when the mistress wept into her pillow, clutching a letter she would never send. They were there when the family lawyer visited, whispering about debts and deeds and documents that must disappear. And sometimes, they remembered. Not every servant became a spy. But some did. Quietly. Carefully. Patiently. Because if you played it right, a single piece of information could save you. Or make you rich. Or destroy the person who thought they owned you. It often began as survival. A housemaid, frightened of dismissal, kept a letter she was ordered to burn. A valet overheard a conversation and jotted down the dates. A governess noticed a bruise on a child and said nothing, yet remembered everything. These scraps became armor. A way to push back against a world that offered no second chances. At first, the secrets were used for protection. A cook caught taking extra food might remind the butler about his drinking. A laundry maid with a child out of wedlock might suggest that the mistress remember her silence when the time came to give a reference. It wasn't open blackmail. Not yet. It was something softer. A look. A pause. A word said with just enough weight to make someone flinch. But the longer you stayed in service, the more you learned. And some began to see patterns. The master always left the house at the same time when he was meeting her. The lady's maid always disposed of certain envelopes in the ash bin, even when they were unopened. The young heir's bruises didn't come from riding accidents. And in that knowledge was power. Some servants became archivists of sin. One by one, they gathered the overlooked pieces, a note slipped into the wrong drawer, a receipt for a debt, a pair of gloves that didn't belong to anyone in the house. They weren't thieves. They were observers. Quiet collectors of chaos. And when the time came, they acted. Sometimes it was subtle. A black-gloved butler approaching the master with a calm voice. "Sir, I believe this belongs to you." A document folded neatly. A suggestion made. A pause. "I've made no copies." Payment followed. In money. In silence. In safety. Other times it was desperate. One maid, cornered by the second son in the wine cellar, escaped and went straight to the housekeeper. Not to beg, but to bargain. She had the letter. The one he sent. The one that proved everything. She offered it in exchange for a transfer to another estate. It worked. Some went further. A valet dismissed unfairly sent a letter to the mistress of the house, detailing her husband's visits to a brothel in Whitechapel. Enclosed was a token, the master's signet ring, lost during one of those visits, and recovered by the servant the next morning. The mistress didn't respond. But 2 weeks later, the valet received a check. And silence. Others used their knowledge as stepping stones. One housekeeper, privy to an inheritance scandal, quietly offered her version of events to the family solicitor. For a price. The result? The second son was disinherited. The housekeeper bought a cottage by the sea. But not every game ended in victory. Some were caught. One laundress who tried to sell letters to a tabloid disappeared within a month. No one ever proved what happened. The story told among servants was that she had been sent to a hospital and never returned. Others said she fled the country. The truth? Buried. There were rules even among blackmailers. Never reveal everything. Never threaten in anger. Always leave something unsaid, something that could still hurt if they refused to pay. And most of all, never be predictable. Some became professionals. There was a network. Small, hidden, but real. A whisper passed from cook to footman. "He deals in stories." These men, and a few women, specialized in secrets. They would buy information, clean it, verify it, and sell it to the right people. Newspapers. Detectives. political rivals, even the families themselves, desperate to know what the servants knew. They called them the dark staff. A few former servants even became full-time investigators, feeding gossip columns with scandal ripped from behind silk curtains. Society never admitted it, but its favorite scandals often came from below stairs. Some noble families hired ex-servants as spies, to watch the rest of the staff, to eavesdrop, to prevent betrayal. But these arrangements were double-edged, because a spy with nothing to lose is a dangerous thing. And then, there were the ones who played the long game. Years spent in one house, smiling, serving, listening, until the day came when everything changed. A mistress found herself blackmailed over a love letter from her youth, written before her marriage, now threatening to destroy her husband's campaign. The letter never should have existed. But the maid who had once helped her dress for her wedding had quietly taken it, knowing, instinctively, that love is a weapon in the wrong hands. The maid retired that same year, to a home she bought in her own name, on land the mistress once mocked her for admiring. There was no justice system for servants, no laws to protect them from abuse. So they built their own kind of justice, one forged in memory and opportunity. And what made them so dangerous wasn't cruelty. It was patience. The upper class forgot. They assumed the servants didn't understand, didn't read, didn't care. But they did. They read every note left on a desk. They understood every whispered insult behind a fan. They cared, deeply, about what it meant to be treated like furniture in a house built by your own hands. So they waited. And when the moment came, they held the match. Some used it to light a candle. Others set the house ablaze. Because secrets, in the right hands, are freedom. Or fire. And the Edwardian world, so obsessed with order and appearances, forgot one truth. The ones who carry your sins are the ones you should fear most.